It's time for another PlayStation Plus update, and you know what that means? That's right, it's time for another Worms game. A quarter century after it was cancelled in the United States, we're finally getting Worms Pinball. We're also getting G-Police by Psygnosis, and the Sony classic 2Xtreme. Yeah, that's exciting news, but are any of these games actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Game Fan, Computer and Video Games, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. Put on your helmet and knee pads, kiddies, because we're about to see if you're too extreme for this episode of PlayStation Plus Review Crew. In the months leading up to the PlayStation's launch, a lot of gamers and critics had major concerns that Sony's first-party support wasn't going to be able to compete with the juggernaut companies like Nintendo and Sega. This ultimately proved to be false thanks to a number of strategic acquisitions made by the company. But I have to imagine that 2Xtreme is the kind of game that everybody was concerned would permeate through the PlayStation's entire library. Released just 1 year after the system's launch, this sequel is as limp and half-assed as you remember. Compared to something like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and other similar games that would come out just a few years later, this extreme sports game feels like it's still clinging on to the last generation and not embracing what can be done with the PlayStation's hardware. Perhaps that's why barely anybody remembers or even talks about Sony's Extreme series. You know, the speed bump you hit while looking for the newest Wipeout sequel. Needless to say, most of the critics were not impressed with 2Xtreme. I say most because there were a couple of outliers, with one of them being Todd Mowat at Electronic Gaming Monthly. Giving it an 8 out of 10, he concluded that the PlayStation's top-selling game worldwide has gotten even better. If you were a fan of the first title, you'll enjoy this one. The challenges are totally different, with more tracks and events added. If you didn't like the first game, then you'll be on the same side of the fence as my pal on the other side of the page. The game does have a lot to offer, and I had a blast. As mentioned in the review, Todd's colleague, Joe Rybicki, was not as impressed with 2Xtreme. This is one of the most unexciting games I've seen on the PlayStation. I wasn't a fan of the first one, and the second one isn't an improvement. You'd think that designers at Sony would really exploit the abilities of the PlayStation. Instead, the graphics are blocky, the animation's jerky, and the course is uninspired. EGM gave 2Xtreme an average score of 6.5 out of 10. For what it's worth, the other outlier was GamePro, who gave the game a shockingly high score of 4.5 out of 5. They genuinely saw something good with the game, calling it worthy of its TV heritage. Plenty of high-speed action, and a tough CPU competitor will keep gamers coming back for more. The biggest appeal is the split-screen 2-player mode for face-to-face action. No matter what, you're assured lightning-fast, entertaining, extreme action. Go for it! But not so fast, said literally every other critic working in 1996. This included Ultra Game Players, who gave the game a cautionary score of 5.9 out of 10. Believe it or not, that's actually considered a high score when compared to Next Generation, who went with a lousy 2 out of 5. That's the exact same score that you saw over at Computer and Video Games, who put it this way. The first one had some cool ideas, good graphics for the time, last year, and a good sense of humor. Unfortunately, 2Xtreme doesn't do anything we'd hoped. The 4 events are still identical, with the only new addition being trick points, and those aren't much fun at all. This is just another one of those games, which, while not completely terrible, has nothing to make it worth buying. The handling, which lets you go around tight corners without steering, and the collision detection, which leaves you stuck behind pillars, just gets annoying. Plus, the lack of original features means that 2Xtreme isn't worth more than a night's rental. Honestly, looking back on it all these years later, I'm not even sure it's worth that much. Seriously, only play this one if you already have nostalgia for 2Xtreme, but even then, I'd say approach this one with caution. When Sony put out the call for third parties to support PlayStation Plus with PS1 classics, Team 17 was right there to pick up. Now, in case you haven't been paying attention, Worms Pinball marks the 4th Worms game to hit the service since release. That's more than any other series, even Star Wars. What's actually pretty cool about this particular release is that it was never released in America, making it one of the very few PS1 games to have its US debut come in the form of the PlayStation Plus. That fact alone makes this an interesting title worth checking out. Let's go ahead and see what the critics said at the time. Because the game never came to America, there aren't a lot of reviews for Worms Pinball. In fact, I basically only found 2. The first was the official UK PlayStation magazine, which gave it a 6 out of 10 in their 55th issue. The other was GameFan, who reviewed the very similar Dreamcast port. ECM gave it a lame 39%, summing it up this way: I love pinball, I love Worms, I do not love Worms Pinball. If you're gonna make a pinball game on a console system, make sure it does things that you simply cannot do in a real pinball machine. Sadly, Team 17 seems to have ignored that cardinal rule, and at their own peril. Like sports games, if I want to play the real thing, I'll go do it in an arcade, not via a hack job console pin. Fury liked the game a little bit more, giving it a 61%, though he starts out weirdly aggressive against Team 17's most popular franchise. Unlike most of the GameFan staff, Worm played no part in my life, and it never will. And guess what? Neither will Worms Pinball. The problem here is that in order for a home console pinball game to be good, it has to be crazy. And Worms Pinball is the polar opposite of that. Now, it's probably worth mentioning that Worms Pinball was part of a more readily available Team 17 game called Addiction Pinball, which is a game that actually did come to America, though only on PC. While Hyper gave the game a 74%, it's actually the next generation review that I want to focus on. Given how GameFan's main problem was that Team 17's pinball game wasn't over the top enough, I thought that this might actually be a good counterpoint. The best part of the game is its attention to realism. The ball looks and moves like it would in an actual pinball table, better than the motion of any other ball in any other pinball game. The reflection on the ball, ramp, and flippers is fantastic as well. And the amber screen, located at the top of the table showing off missions, scores, and bonuses, is also nicely done. It looks just like the screen in your local arcade's pinball machine, yet it fades into the table just enough so as not to distract. Simply, Addiction Pinball is the smoothest playing and the best looking pinball game we've seen. You know what? I suggest you give Worms Pinball a play, just to see if you prefer the dedication to realism, or if you would have preferred it to be more, over the top and crazy.
The end is nigh! An almighty battle where two armies wield weapons of deadly destruction, skunk missiles, deranged grannies, exploding sheep, and people will flee from the world.
Worms Armageddon with 60 new weapons.
Tell me, sir.
The end of the world is nigh on ridiculous.
When it came to the 32-bit era, one of the earliest breakout companies was the Liverpool-based developer Psygnosis. They played a vital role in the early days of the PlayStation, pushing the boundaries with games like Destruction Derby, Colony Wars, and most importantly, the Wipeout series. G-Police took their experience in world building and upped the stakes with a story-driven action game set in a futuristic city full of crime. Although limited by what the 32-bit hardware was capable of, G-Police is the kind of big, ambitious showpiece that you can't help but root for. Simply put, there's nothing else like it on the PlayStation, and you saw a lot of that excitement in the reviews. When it came to the critics, pretty much everybody was impressed with what Psygnosis was able to do on the PlayStation. Over at Electronic Gaming Monthly, Dan gave the game an 8 out of 10, praising the people behind the game. With G-Police, Psygnosis reminds everybody why they're such a big publisher. This stylish game builds a realistic and immersive world via cinemas and storyline, sights, and sounds. The control left a little to be desired. Analog is too sensitive, digital is too clunky. Poor control, plus speedy gameplay, plus lots of buildings equals disaster. But it's no big deal. I still recommend it highly. Crispin seemed to like the game even more than Dan, comparing it to a cult favorite. G-Police has the most incredible cityscapes ever seen in a game. There's just something too cool about chasing bogeys between skyscrapers and over traffic-jammed streets. No game since Snatcher has created such a Blade Runner-esque atmosphere. EGM gave G-Police an average score of 8.4 out of 10. This is pretty much in line with where the rest of the critics were at the time. For example, you saw GameFan give G-Police the exact same score of 84%, and GamePro went a tad lower with a score of 4 out of 5. Now that's the exact same score you saw over at Computer and Video Games, as well as PSM. In fact, they argued that the control takes some time to get used to but works acceptably. You're given complete freedom to fly where you want within the large dome city, which unfortunately leads to the game's only real drawback. The pop-in is dramatic and affects gameplay, as things fade in and out of the black background nearby. You can adjust this somewhat by decreasing and increasing the game's speed. Doing so increases and decreases the viewing distance and angle, but never to the point of clarity. When all added up, G-Police really draws you in, making you feel like you're part of the game. Now that's the basement when it comes to scores, but there were a few that were much higher than that. Ultra Game players went as high as an 85%, also acknowledging some of the technical issues. And then there's the official US PlayStation magazine, which gave it a high score of 4.5 out of 5. They raved about the detailed environments, the great control, and the detailed, fully fleshed out story. Though they did end their review with a few gripes. The somewhat jerky frame rate and extremely noticeable draw-in can be adjusted from the comprehensive options screen. And I did notice a strange popping sound in the speakers during the radio communication, which got a bit annoying. But overall, G-Police is a unique, challenging, and engrossing title that no sci-fi or flight sim fan should miss. You know what? This is one of those great games that desperately needs to be remade. Look, the game was simply too ambitious for the PlayStation hardware, and these days a developer could really execute on the game's true potential. I'd love to see a remaster by Night Dive. Give it a play on PS Plus and you'll see what I mean.
They killed my sister. But this wasn't vengeance, it was simple justice.
Slayer, stay in formation.
You're Jeff Slater of the G-Police. You got the firepower to do the job right. Do you have the guns?
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes that are just like this one every time Sony adds PS1 games to their online service. We have a whole playlist with pretty much every game they've added to the PS Plus, so go ahead and give that a binge when you have a second. Now, here's the question I have for you. What PlayStation 1 game do you want to see added to the PlayStation Plus? Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with more reviews and maybe even a new Game Over episode. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.